Hi there. Welcome to an online lecture introducing marginal costing and showing how it compares to absorption costing, which hopefully you've already seen in this syllabus. Now, if you remember, absorption costing focused on how to split indirect costs between the units of production. So if we've got overheads, things like rent charges, things like electricity bills, we'll need to try and split them out between the individual units of production. Remember, this is a key aspect of costing, trying to identify the cost per unit so that perhaps we can charge an appropriate price. We're now going to be looking at an alternative approach to costing called marginal costing. Let's start by just highlighting the differences between these two approaches. Well, absorption costing, which we actually have already dealt with, is sometimes known as full costing. Because under absorption costing, the cost card for a unit, if you remember, the cost card is where we summarise the various costs that we incur making a unit, the cost card will include all production costs, both variable and fixed. That's why it's called full costing, because it includes all production costs. Marginal costing, on the other hand, is sometimes known as variable costing, because marginal costing focuses only on the variable costs of producing a unit. It actually ignores the fixed costs of making a unit. On the basis that if you imagine a fixed cost like rent, can you imagine your landlord doesn't actually care how many units you make? Let's have a look at an example and I'll talk about that difference. So let's say we're comparing cost cards for producing a cake or something. Now, as we pull together our costs, we tend to start with the direct costs. Now, if you remember, direct costs are the ones that can be described as traceable because they can be traced to individual units of production. So let's say in my bakery, each cake needs 4 kilograms of flour. I can trace 4 kilograms of flour to each cake I'm baking. I can therefore treat that as a direct material. Direct material, 4 kilograms per cake, let's say at £5 per kilogram. That would be 20 pounds of flour for each cake I'm baking. Now let's consider the difference between absorption costing and marginal costing. Now, absorption costing is called full costing because it will include all costs, both variable and fixed. So it does include the £20 of direct material. Direct material will be a variable cost because the more cakes you bake, the more flour you'll need, the higher the cost will therefore become. Marginal costing, sometimes called variable costing, well actually that will also include the £20 because that is a variable cost. So in fact, they both include the direct materials. We might then have some direct labour. Let's say it takes our cooks 5 hours to mix the ingredients and to put the cakes into the oven and to ice them. And let's say I pay them £6 per hour. Well, that is a direct cost. I can trace 5 hours of their time to each unit they've dealt with. And 5 hours times £6, well, that's £30 of direct labour. And again, that would be included in the absorption costing cost card because that is part of the full cost. The whole point of absorption costing is it will include all costs. And it will also be included in the marginal costing cost card because direct labour is also a variable cost. If you want to bake more cakes, you're going to have to pay your staff for more hours, aren't you? And in fact, if we then added up the direct cost to give the so-called prime cost, you can see at that point the two cost cards are the same. They would both give £50 per unit. Well, if the direct costs are the traceable costs, they make up the prime cost. Indirect costs are the ones that I always describe as being shared costs. They can't be traced to individual units. They're shared over lots and lots of units. Hence the term we often use to describe them, which is overheads. Now, direct costs will always be variable, because if you can trace an amount of cost to a single unit, if you want to make more units, you'll need more of that cost. But overheads can be either variable or fixed. Now, a good example of a variable overhead might be the electricity to run your machinery. An awful lot of manufacturing in this day and age is done with machinery, done with automation. As a result, you're likely to be incurring electricity charges. And in fact, that member of staff that spent 5 hours mixing the ingredients for each cake, they would probably be using a big mixing machine. And so the 5 hours of their time probably implies 5 hours of electricity as well. And let's say we're paying the electricity £3 per hour. That's therefore £15 worth of electricity per cake. Now that variable overhead would be included in the absorption costing cost card because that is the full cost. It will include everything. And it will also be included in the marginal cost card on the basis that it is a variable cost. It's a variable overhead. If you bake more cakes, your machinery will be on for longer, so your electricity charge will increase. The big difference comes in with a fixed overhead. Now the fixed overhead, let's say our rent. The fixed overhead, if our rent is £30,000 for a month, you can't trace that to an individual unit that you've made. You can't trace that to an individual cake that you've baked. That needs to be shared over lots and lots of units. Now, let's say in that month we've produced 2,500 cakes. Well, £30,000 spread over 2,500 units would be £12 per unit. In fact, that's actually what we've seen previously in the syllabus is an overhead absorption rate. I've worked out an OAR on a per unit basis there of £12. Now that £12 will be included in the absorption costing cost card because this is full costing. It will include variable and fixed costs, but it will not be included in the marginal costing cost card because marginal costing is only interested in the variable costs. And obviously the fixed overhead is not a variable cost. That's your rent. That's got nothing to do with the number of units you're producing. So in fact, if I then add up the total production cost per unit, I've got a total under absorption costing, so the so-called full production cost would be £77, and under marginal costing of only £65. That is the marginal or the variable cost per unit. You can see they're very, very similar. The big difference is that absorption costing does include a little bit of the fixed overhead, whereas marginal costing does not. The reason being, I mean, if you take that £12 OAR we've calculated, although it's useful to identify what the effective overhead cost per unit is, that figure's a bit of a nonsense. If you make one more unit, you don't have to pay your landlord another £12 rent, do you? Because rent is a fixed cost. And that's really what marginal costing is saying, is it's only interested in the true costs you incur if you make another unit. And in fact, one of the key differences, if we think about these numbers that we've now calculated, we've actually got two possible costs per unit, and actually we might use those two costs per unit in slightly different situations. For instance, let's imagine that a customer comes into my factory desperate to buy one of my units, but let's say they've only got £70. And I've got to decide, should I sell them a unit for £70? Well, if I use the absorption costing information, which shows me that the cost per unit is 77, I'd probably turn the customer down and say, well, no, I can't sell to you for £70. I won't make any money. In fact, I'd make a loss. But if I look at the marginal costing information, well, my cost per unit is £65. So maybe I should sell for 70. Well, which is the right answer? Well, it depends. If it's a single customer literally just wanting to buy one unit from me in what we might call the short term, well, actually, I should go for the marginal information. The reason being, in the very short term, it's only the variable costs that would actually alter. Now, if I imagine, let me just tidy this up a little bit. If I imagine this one car this customer wants to buy, well, if I produce this one car, will I incur some extra material costs? Well, yes, I will. Will I incur some extra labour costs? Yes, I will. Will I incur the extra variable overhead for the machinery? Well, yes, I will. Will my rent cost increase? Well, actually, no, it won't. If I make one extra unit, my landlord isn't going to charge me any extra. So in fact, for producing that one unit, the cost I would incur would be £65. That's literally the marginal cost. That's the cost I incur for a single extra unit. So should I sell it for £70? Well, actually, yes, I should. I'd be up £5. So in the short term, we often describe marginal costing as being more appropriate, because in the short term, fixed costs like rent tend not to change. But in the long term, we do ultimately have to cover our rent, Can you imagine if I was charging £70 for every single unit, I will make losses across the whole year. So perhaps in the longer term, so if I'm deciding prices for the year, for instance, I should use absorption costing on the basis that I should try and charge at least £77 because I do need to cover my fixed costs at some point. So for a single one-off transaction, your fixed costs won't change, so you can use the marginal cost. Whereas if I'm looking at a long-term decision, perhaps on the prices I'm going to charge over the whole year, well, I do need to cover my fixed costs somewhere, so I'm probably better to use the absorption costing information.